Welcome to BC Gnomonics. Which of these two dials is an equatorial dial, and which is an armillary? If you say they're both equatorial dials, you certainly wouldn't be wrong, although one of these dials also belongs to the subclassification of armillary. Now, before we answer that question, let's take a look at two dials. This one, as you can see, has an hour plate that, if extended, would run parallel to the Earth's axis of rotation. This one, the classic image of a portable equatorial dial, has an hour plane that, if extended, would run parallel to the Earth's equator. Now, these can both be considered equatorial dials, although this one is technically an armillary dial, and that might surprise you because it does not look at all like an armillary sphere. And that's where the misconception lies, as many people think that to be considered an armillary dial, the sundial has to resemble an armillary sphere, perhaps with completed rings or an added ring for either the ecliptic or the tropics. But that's not necessary, although it is often present. In reality, this is an armillary dial simply by nature of the fact that its hour plane parallels the Earth's axis of rotation. That is the only requirement for a dial to be considered an armillary dial. Additionally, armillary dials do not require a polar gnomon, although many of them feature one. This gnomon could also be attached to the dial plane via a straight rod running from the nodus down to the plate. Let's revisit this example. Which one of these is the armillary and which is the pure equatorial? If you said this one is the armillary, you'd be correct. Although its band is thinner, it nevertheless parallels the Earth's axis of rotation and the gnomon if it were to be extended. While this dial doesn't feature any rings other than the equatorial, it is nevertheless an armillary dial. Many armillary dials do feature rings, as I said previously, but they don't need to. Sometimes they'll feature full rings containing the tropics, the ecliptic occasionally, always the equator, and sometimes you'll see some containing rings for the local meridian, often used as a support mechanism, as this one has running here. Now, when these rings are cut, it makes it much easier to read, as when the sun is at its peak, especially on the equinox, you can easily read the shadow of the nodus. Now, I have one last example for this discussion, and that is this very interesting dial. It goes by two names, the self-orienting armillary dial and the universal equatorial ring dial. Now, both names are accurate, as if it falls into the armillary category, it automatically falls into the equatorial category as well. But does this constitute an armillary dial or simply an equatorial? Seeing as though the numerals are arranged on the top of a ring-like structure similar to this equatorial dial, you might say equatorial. But when you're actually using this dial, you'll watch the nodus as its beam of light traces along the inner edge of this dial, only using the numbers in reference to the sunspot's actual position along this scale. So, despite the fact that the numbers are listed along the top of the ring, because the sun actually moves along the inner side of the band, that constitutes an armillary dial. So the name self-orienting armillary dial for this dial in particular would technically be the more accurate term, although it could very well be called self-orienting armillary dial, equatorial ring dial interchangeably. Thank you for watching.